Karatha leaned back in her seat at the Galactic Council chambers, her crystalline form catching the light. As the human delegation entered through the massive doors that opened with a soft hiss of hydraulic systems, the stories about humans had circulated through every corner of the known galaxy for generations, whispered in the halls of power, and laughed about in the bars of remote stations across 1,000 different worlds. Tales of warriors who came from a single harsh planet and somehow managed to threaten established civilizations. But Karatha had always found these legends amusing rather than genuinely concerning. She watched carefully as 5 human representatives walked into the chamber, their smaller frames making them appear almost fragile compared to the towering forms of other species gathered here. Their skin soft and unprotected without the scales or shells or exoskeletons that marked most advanced civilizations. Their eyes limited in range and perception compared to species that could see into infrared or ultraviolet spectrums. The leader was a man named Marcus, and he carried himself with a confidence that Karatha found endearing in its innocent naivety. Standing straight and meeting the eyes of each council member with what he probably believed was an expression of equality, though to her trained observation it read more like a young creature trying to appear brave before something far greater and more powerful. When Marcus began to speak, his voice was steady and his words were carefully chosen, presenting humanity's request to join the interspecies defense coalition with all the logic and reasoning of a species that had spent considerable time studying diplomatic protocols and communication strategies. But there was something almost apologetic in his tone, as if he understood deep down that his people had no real right to sit at this ancient table, that they were being allowed here out of charity rather than necessity or merit. Karatha found herself smiling as she listened to his words, a gesture she had learned by studying human behavior and facial expressions for her ongoing research into newly emerged species. But it was not a smile of warmth or respect or genuine welcome. It was a smile of quiet amusement at how earnestly these young creatures tried to prove their worth, how they did not boast or exaggerate or make grand claims about their abilities and capabilities, instead speaking only of cooperation and mutual benefit in a way that clearly suggested they did not truly believe they had anything particularly valuable or unique to contribute. The other council members asked questions with varying degrees of interest and skepticism, and the humans answered each question with impressive patience and absolute clarity, their responses methodical and orderly and completely without the natural swagger that a truly accomplished warrior species would display when negotiating with peers, which only confirmed Karatha's existing assessment that these beings were simply explorers and colonists and traders, playing at being something greater than they actually were. Marcus spoke of human determination and human adaptability, words that seemed quaint coming from someone representing a species that had only recently achieved space travel through considerable effort and determination. He spoke of human values and human commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves, ideals that sounded noble but ultimately impractical in a galaxy where survival belonged to the strongest and most technologically advanced one council member, a tall being made entirely of what appeared to be living metal. Asked directly about humanity's military capacity and combat experience, whether they had fought in any significant conflicts or faced any serious challenges that would indicate they possessed genuine warrior capability rather than mere enthusiasm. Marcus answered honestly, describing skirmishes with pirates and minor conflicts with less advanced species. Nothing that would suggest humans possessed any particular martial talent or that they had proven themselves in true combat against genuinely formidable opponents. And as he spoke, Karatha felt a curious mixture of sympathy and dismissal. Sympathy for beings trying so hard to matter in a vast universe that barely noticed their existence, but dismissal of any serious threat they might represent. When the session concluded after several hours of discussion and deliberation, the Council voted to accept humanity into the coalition with minimal opposition, assigning them to guard the outer frontier stations where minor pirate incursions and small-scale threats required monitoring, but nothing that would truly test a civilization's genuine military capabilities or leadership abilities, a position that Kiratha viewed as something between mercy and punishment, a way to let these young humans believe they were contributing meaningfully to galactic security while keeping them safely away from any real conflict that might expose their fundamental weakness. The assignment was to Frontier Station 7, a remote outpost at the edge of known space where the humans would face occasional minor raids from pirates and desperate criminals, but nothing that would seriously threaten their existence or demonstrate whether their legendary reputation held any actual truth. In the real galaxy, as the human delegation departed from the chamber, Marcus paused and looked directly at where Kiratha sat, and she saw in his eyes something that reminded her vaguely of the old legends, a kind of quiet determination and inner strength that seemed almost contradictory in such a fragile-looking being. But she dismissed the thought quickly and firmly, returning his respectful nod with that same smile of quiet superiority that had become so natural and familiar to her. Legends were nothing more than stories, she reminded herself as she watched them go. Ancient tales created to inspire courage in younger civilizations. Perhaps exaggerated accounts of some early human victory that had been magnified and distorted over generations, until it bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. And there was certainly no reason to believe that these 5 representatives, standing before the galaxy's most powerful council, represented anything more than a species of fortunate survivors who had managed to reach the stars through luck and persistence rather than genuine military capability or tactical genius. She stood and walked from the chamber with slow, measured steps, her crystalline form reflecting the artificial light in fractured patterns across the walls and floor, still smiling that smile of superior amusement, completely unaware that everything she believed about humans and their capabilities was about to be tested and challenged in ways that would shake the foundations of her understanding and force her to reconsider the very nature of what made a civilization truly formidable. The transport ship descended toward Frontier Station 7 with all the grace of a species that had been traveling between planets for less than a century, and Kiratha watched from the viewport as the station grew larger, a metallic structure that orbited a barren moon in one of the outer sectors, a place that most established civilizations considered remote and unimportant enough to assign to populations that had not yet proven their worth. She had volunteered for this assignment almost immediately after the council meeting concluded, telling her superiors that she wanted to document human performance in a practical setting, to gather data on whether these new arrivals to galactic civilization would truly be assets or liabilities. But in truth, she was curious in a way that she had not expected, wanting to observe how quickly humans would fail when confronted with real responsibility, rather than simple theoretical discussions in a council chamber. The station itself was busy when she arrived, filled with the controlled chaos of a military installation preparing for active deployment, soldiers moving in organized patterns with purpose and direction, equipment being loaded onto transport vehicles and secured aboard the smaller patrol ships that would make up the human contingent's operational capacity, everything moving with a kind of efficiency that Kiratha had not anticipated. Marcus was there to greet her personally, which she found somewhat amusing, as if her presence was something of significant consequence to humanity's broader operations. He showed her to the observation quarters where she would remain during her assignment, explaining in clear terms what the human contingent had been tasked with doing: monitoring the outer trade routes for pirate activity, responding to distress signals from mining colonies in the region, and generally maintaining peace in a sector that had been plagued by minor criminal enterprises and unorganized violence. The human force numbered approximately 3,000 personnel, which struck Kiaratha as impressive in scale, but wholly inadequate for the region they were meant to protect. And their equipment was what she could only describe as quaint. Their ship smaller than any military vessel she had ever seen. Their weapons technology at least 2 generations behind what the galactic standard considered acceptable. Their sensors less advanced than what species half their age typically possessed yet. As she observed during the first few weeks, she noticed something she had not anticipated. The humans worked together in a way that seemed almost natural. A coordination between different units and departments that suggested extensive practice and genuine understanding of how to operate as a cohesive force rather than as isolated groups. They maintained their equipment with obsessive care, performing maintenance checks that went far beyond what would normally be required, ensuring that every system was functioning at optimal capacity there. Training exercises were conducted with intense focus and concentration. Soldiers running combat scenarios repeatedly until movements became instinctive and responses automatic. They practiced boarding procedures and emergency protocols and tactical formations over and over, each repetition refining their performance, smoothing out inefficiencies, building muscle memory that would allow them to respond correctly, even in moments of extreme stress and chowskier. Etha attended one training session where a group of human soldiers practiced responding to a simulated station breach, attacking scenarios where hostile forces had somehow infiltrated the facility and needed to be contained and eliminated. She watched as these fragile-looking beings moved through corridors with focused intensity, communicating through complex hand signals and radio communications, adapting their tactics instantly when the simulation presented unexpected variables. What struck her most was their speed. Not the absolute speed of their bodies, which was unremarkable, but rather the speed of their decision-making, the way they could process a situation and determine the appropriate response in seconds, the way they seemed to anticipate where problems might occur before those problems actually manifested. During her second month at the station, Kiaratha encountered a group of human officers in the central hub. Among them was a woman named Victoria, who held the rank of combat specialist and had quickly proven herself competent in her field, coordinating pilot training and weapon system operations with impressive competence and attention to detail. Kiaratha approached her with the kind of curious interest that a researcher might show toward a fascinating specimen. Victoria greeted her with the courtesy and politeness that seemed to characterize all human interactions. They spoke for nearly 2 hours about human culture and human history, about what had driven humanity to venture into space despite coming from a world that would kill most species instantly, about Earth as Victoria described it, a harsh and unforgiving place marked by extreme weather and dangerous predators and limited resources. Victoria spoke of Earth with what Kiaratha recognized as genuine affection and longing despite its harshness. She spoke of family and duty and something Victoria called standing for something bigger than yourself. The concept of sacrifice, not because it was required but because it was right, of choosing to protect others, even when doing so came at personal cost. Kiaratha found the concept touching in an abstract way, but ultimately impractical. Loyalty based on abstract ideals rather than survival instincts seemed inefficient and wasteful. Yet she could not deny that Victoria's eyes held something that commanded a certain form of respect, a depth of character forged in hardship that no amount of technological advancement could replicate or manufacture. The woman explained that humans came from a world where survival was never guaranteed, where the environment itself was constantly trying to kill you, where nature gave no mercy to the weak or the unprepared. And perhaps because of this, humans had developed something different than other species. Not just a drive to survive, but a drive to protect, to build, to create something lasting and meaningful. As their conversation wound down and Victoria prepared to return to her duties, Karatha found herself smiling that same smile again. Polite and superior, and certain of her own understanding and evaluation of the situation. She was observing a species of fortunate survivors and nothing more. Beings who had gotten lucky and managed to reach space, but who would prove ultimately unremarkable when tested against the truly advanced civilizations of the galaxy. She did not realize that in a few days her certainty would be shattered, that she would witness something that would force her to reconsider everything she had observed and everything she thought she understood about humanity and the nature of true strength. The distress signal came without warning in the middle of a routine morning. An automated beacon from a mining colony called Thorium Station, which sat 3 sectors away and had been established for barely 2 years. The signal itself was simple and contained minimal information, but what it did convey was absolute clarity. The colony was under attack and the defensive systems were failing. Rapidly, Karatha received the notification while reviewing routine reports in her observation post. The data indicating that approximately 5,000 miners and support personnel were present at the colony. That the attacking force appeared to be the Valkath Collective, a militaristic species known for their brutal tactics and overwhelming firepower. That the colony's defensive capabilities were minimal and designed only to deter pirates and small-scale criminal enterprises, not organized military forces. The Valkath ships were far superior to anything the humans possessed. Their vessels faster and more heavily armored. Their weapons more advanced and more destructive. Their command structures more experienced with real combat against genuine opposition. By any reasonable calculation, any human attempt to assist the colony would result in catastrophic failure and complete annihilation of the human force. Karatha expected Marcus to request backup from the main galactic fleet, to acknowledge the harsh mathematical reality of the situation, to wait patiently for reinforcements that were weeks away, to make the logical choice that any reasonable commander would make when faced with impossible odds. Instead, Marcus called for an emergency council meeting. Within minutes, she found herself in the council chambers again, watching as Marcus stood before the galactic leadership with the same quiet confidence he had displayed weeks ago. Though now something about him seemed different, sharper, more focused. His eyes held a kind of determination that had been absent before. He presented the situation with absolute clarity, detailing the colony size, the attacking force composition, the time constraints. And then he stated his intention with simple directness. The human contingent would respond to the distress call. They would engage the Valkath force. They would do everything in their power to protect the colony from destruction. The council members expressed immediate skepticism and outright concern. One ancient being who had lived for 3 centuries and fought in dozens of wars simply laughed, asking if the humans understood what they were proposing, whether they comprehended the disparity in military capability, whether Marcus was truly suggesting that 3,000 soldiers could successfully oppose 5,000 experienced warriors with superior technology. Marcus answered calmly, speaking in the measured tones of someone presenting established fact rather than mere opinion. He explained that humans would not win through overwhelming force because they could not match the Valkath's strength in that regard. Instead, they would win through tactical adaptation and asymmetrical response, through exploiting the enemy's assumptions and preconceptions, through using human strengths in unexpected ways. He detailed approach vectors that would keep human ships hidden from Valkath sensors until the final moments of engagement. He spoke of diversionary tactics and coordinated strikes, of flying patterns that Valkath pilots would find unpredictable because they operated from different assumptions about physics and combat strategy. He explained how human biological brains could adapt to changing circumstances faster than most species because humans came from a world where adaptation meant the difference between survival and death. The council remained skeptical, but they granted permission, largely because watching humans fail so spectacularly would provide valuable data about the limits of this young species. They wanted documentation of the moment when reality would demonstrate the vast gulf between legend and actual capability. Marcus returned to the station and began mobilizing all available personnel. Kiratha watched as humans moved through the corridors with focused intensity rather than panic or despair. Weapons were checked, not once, but multiple times. Combat systems were tested and retested. Strategies were discussed and refined again. The human soldiers seemed to accept the odds not with resignation, but with something approaching calm. Determination. Victoria appeared in the Flight Operations Center, moving through the space with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice and genuine competence. She ran pilots through combat scenarios repeatedly, explaining tactics and discussing approach vectors and teaching her team to think not just about how to execute their own assigned tasks, but how their actions would affect the broader tactical picture. Atha found herself watching Victoria again, observing how the woman prepared herself mentally for what would likely be her final battle. She saw Victoria pause and look at a photograph of Earth that she carried, a blue and green world shrouded in white clouds. She saw Victoria close her eyes for a moment in what might have been prayer or meditation, or simply centering herself before combat. Then Victoria moved to say goodbye to her crew members, not with the kind of finality that suggested she thought she would not return, but rather with the kind of warmth and genuine care that suggested these people mattered to her beyond their utility as soldiers. She touched shoulders and offered firm handshakes and spoke words of encouragement that rang with absolute sincerity. The human fleet launched from the station with everything they possessed, every fighter and every gunship and every weapon. They committed their entire force to this response, leaving the station itself nearly defenseless because they believed that protecting the colony was more important than maintaining security at their base. Kiratha realized in that moment that she was watching something that contradicted everything she had assumed about logical military command. What kind of species sacrificed their own security to help strangers on a remote colony? What kind of warriors would charge into battle with odds stacked so heavily against them? What kind of civilization would gamble everything on a single action when that action had so little probability of success? She realized that she had no answer to those questions, that her entire framework for understanding military capability and strategic thinking had been built around species that operated according to principles of self-preservation and logical probability calculation. And as the human fleet jumped toward the waiting Velkath force, Kiratha found herself abandoning her smile of superiority for the first time since arriving at the station. The battle unfolded across the monitoring screens at the station with a clarity that forced Kiratha to watch every second in real time, unable to look away despite her mounting shock at what she was witnessing. The human fleet dropped out of warp space precisely where Marcus had calculated they would, their approach vectors invisible to Velkath sensors until the absolute final moments of engagement. And in those first seconds, Kiratha saw something that defied her expectations. The first human strike was executed with surgical precision. 3 ships moving in perfect synchronization attacked the Velkath dreadnought shield generators in a coordinated strike that suggested not weeks of hasty preparation, but years of intensive practice and repeated drill. The human pilots understood not just their own roles, but how their actions would interact with the actions of their wingmates, creating an effect far greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. The Velkath force responded with overwhelming firepower. Weapons that should have vaporized the smaller, less advanced human vessels. The energy weapons and railguns and kinetic impact systems that have proven so devastatingly effective against every other species in known space. But the human ships were already moving, already repositioning themselves with maneuvers that defied the tactical expectations of Velkath commander's gear. Atha watched as Victoria's fighter squadron moved with what could only be described as perfect synchronization. Each pilot understanding without verbal communication where their wingmates would be, what their wingmates would do, how they could cover each other's weaknesses and amplify each other's strengths. Victoria herself flew patterns that seemed almost impossible, her ship moving through corridors of enemy fire as if she could predict exactly where the weapons would discharge. The Velkath had superior weapons and superior armor and superior speed in individual ship comparisons. Yet the humans were winning because they fought not as individual units but as a unified organism, where pilots understood each other so completely that they could coordinate actions that required split-second timing and perfect trust in their teammates, where each human soldier was willing to place their survival in the hands of their comrades. A bomber pilot named Derek, who had trained at the station for weeks, flew his heavy craft directly toward a Velkath capital ship, knowing with absolute mathematical certainty that his probability of survival was near zero. He guided his vessel through impossible maneuvers, avoiding weapons fire that should have incinerated him long seconds before. He maintained his approach vector with unwavering focus, despite impacts that shattered his shields and damaged his hull derricks. Communications remained calm throughout his final approach. He spoke to his wife on Earth through a recorded message that would reach her eventually. He told her that he was doing what humans did, protecting those who could not protect themselves, serving something larger than his own existence. And then he guided his damaged ship directly at the Velkath capital ship's reactor core when his vessel was struck by defensive fire and began to fall toward the planet's atmosphere below. Derek's final conscious act was to ensure that the wreckage would fall away from the civilian colony, that his sacrifice would not become a liability, but a protection. He died not raging or desperate, but with the calm acceptance of someone at peace with their choices. Victoria engaged 4 Velkath fighters simultaneously, an act that should have resulted in her immediate destruction. But her human reflexes and her understanding of three-dimensional flight proved superior to the more powerful vessel she faced. She outmaneuvered opponents who had superior numbers and superior technology because she understood something fundamental about adaptation and improvisation that went beyond what any mathematical model could predict. She flew through space like water flowing around obstacles, like wind that could not be caught or contained, like something that could adapt and respond and think faster than the rigid command structures of her opponents. The Velkath pilots were superior in individual capability, but Victoria understood teamwork in a way that transcended normal communication. She and her wingmates moved as one entity, creating tactics that were impossible for the Velkath to counter because they were based on trust and coordination rather than individual superiority. The battle raged across space for 3 hours. 3 hours during which the human force took catastrophic damage, during which they lost personnel and ships and capability. Yet they continued to advance and adapt and respond. They created new tactics as Velkath defenses proved more effective than expected. They coordinated their efforts with an intensity that bordered on the magical. They fought not for conquest or glory, but simply because people on that colony needed protection, and they had chosen to provide it. By the time the Velkath force finally broke and retreated back toward their territory, their ships damaged and their commanders confused by tactics they had never encountered in their centuries of military operation, the human contingent had suffered irreplaceable losses. Over 173 personnel had died. Ships had been destroyed. Equipment had been lost. But the colony remained safe. Every civilian on Thorium's station had been protected from destruction. Kaitheth sat in her observation post in absolute silence, unable to process what her screens had shown her, unable to reconcile what she had just witnessed with everything she had believed about humans and human capability. The legends were not exaggerations of past events. The legends were truth. And she had just watched that truth fight and sacrifice and win against impossible odds through nothing more than determination and trust and willingness to choose duty over survival. 3 days later, when the wounded had been treated and the dead had been honored, and the station had begun the long process of understanding what had occurred, Kiaratha attended a formal reception that Marcus had organized. It was not a celebration in the traditional sense. There was no triumphant music or displays of conquest or boastful speeches about victory. Instead, it was a gathering designed to acknowledge, sacrifice, and to honor those who had given their lives. The human soldiers moved through the reception with quiet dignity, many of them bearing visible injuries. Bandages on limbs where Velkath weapons had struck them, scars that would take months to heal. But their eyes held something that Kiaratha had never seen before in any species. Not the arrogance of victory, but the somber respect that came from understanding the cost of what they had. Accomplished Victoria found Kiaratha standing alone, watching the gathering with an expression that must have revealed her internal confusion. The human woman wore her dress uniform with a minor injury bandage visible on her arm. Her hair was neatly arranged, and her bearing was perfectly military. Yet her eyes held warmth and genuine concern when she approached. They stood in silence for a moment. And then Victoria spoke, thanking Kiaratha for observing the battle, thanking her for being present to see what humans could truly do, offering gratitude not for validation but for witness, as if the presence of someone who had doubted and now could no longer doubt somehow made the sacrifice of her dead comrades more meaningful. Atha found herself speaking before she had fully formulated her thoughts. She told Victoria that she had come to this station expecting to watch humans fail, that she had fully believed the legends were exaggerations and myths, that she had come with the certainty that her assumptions about human weakness would be completely validated by actual combat performance, but instead, she admitted she had witnessed something that contradicted everything she had assumed about military capability and warrior nature. She had seen humans take on impossible odds and somehow emerge victorious, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through qualities that she could barely articulate, through coordination so perfect it seemed telepathic, through adaptability that went beyond logical military doctrine, through a willingness to sacrifice that went against every principle of self-preservation. She continued, explaining that she now understood that strength was not always measured in the weapons a civilization carried. It was not always found in the technology a species possessed. That true strength lived in the choices that beings made, in the willingness to sacrifice for those who could not protect themselves, in the ability to think beyond the boundaries that limited other species, in the cooperation and trust that allowed individuals to become something far greater than they could ever be alone. Victoria listened with patience. And when Kiaratha finally finished speaking, the human woman extended her hand in the gesture of partnership that Kiaratha had observed before, this time understanding its true meaning, not a gesture between equals trying to appear equal, but an offer of genuine respect from one warrior to another. Kiaratha took that hand and felt something shift in her understanding of the galaxy and her place in it. She recognized in that moment that she had just witnessed something that few beings in the galaxy would ever truly comprehend. She had seen humans not as colonists or explorers or traders, but as what they truly were, warriors of a kind that could not be measured by conventional military standards. Warriors whose strength came not from the outside, but from something internal. Something that had been forged in the harsh light of Earth and carried across the stars into a galaxy that still did not understand what it is truly faced over the following weeks. As Karatha prepared to return to the council chambers, she compiled her observations and her data and her conclusions, but more importantly, she compiled her revised understanding of what humanity represented to galactic civilization. Not a young species to be guided and protected and assigned minor tasks, but a force that should be taken seriously, that should be recognized for what it truly was when she presented her findings to the Galactic Council. She spoke of military tactics and strategic coordination. She presented data on the battle and the casualties and the outcome, but she also spoke of something else, of sacrifice and trust, and a kind of strength that could not be reduced in numbers or specifications, of a species that had proven through action rather than words that the old legends were not myth but history, that humans were exactly what the ancient stories describe. The council listened with new attention, with respect that they had not shown before, and Karatha realized that her words carried weight now because she had changed, because she had come as a skeptic and left as someone who believed, someone who had seen the legends made flesh and had been forced to reconsider everything she thought. She knew about the nature of strength and warrior capability, and as she spoke, she thought of Victoria and Derek and all the others who had died and returned from that station. She thought of how humans had proven that legends were not just stories but reflections of something essential about their species, something that would shape the galaxy's future in ways that no one could fully predict. The humans had earned their place, not through politics or negotiation, but through sacrifice and action and unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of the cost.